Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shner Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. We are on episode 23 for the 11th of Teves during a leap year. And so in today's episode, it's going to be a little long. We're covering an entire chapter today. It's chapter 8. And we're going to continue going into, the subject that we've been talking about in the past couple of episodes is this idea of the difference between activities which are permitted but not done in the most ideal way, meaning not having the best intention when you do these things, versus activities that are outright forbidden. And obviously both of these categories are not ideal, but we've discussed a little bit the difference between them and the different effect that is happening when you do these things and how to rectify these things. So just to give a little bit of a recap, we talked about how activities which are permitted, so they're done with permitted objects, like, different kinds of animals which are kosher, or various, herbs or inanimate objects or things like that are technically permitted. There's no law in the Torah saying that you can't use these things. So we talked about how the life force that's found within these objects, these permissible objects, is what we have called klipas noga. It's the translucent klipa that conceals godliness, but it's a little bit translucent. So we have the ability to elevate it if we so choose, but that ability is within our power. And if we use these objects in a way that is not godly, that is not totally for the sake of serving God, what happens is that the klipa within these objects descends down into the three impure klipos. And if we use it for holiness, then it ascends up to holiness. And so we said that if we use these objects for not the ideal way, and so it descends into the three impure klipos, since these objects are technically permissible, you can redeem them. So they are what we call heter. This is why things that are permissible are called heter, because heter alludes to the fact, it means in Hebrew something that is not bound, something that is free. And so because it's free, it's kind of like free flowing. So it's like, okay, you didn't use these things in the most ideal way, so now it descended down into the three impure klipos, but because it's not bound, you have the ability then to go back and, with your intention, go back and rectify these objects and elevate them back up into holiness if you at a later time come to this realization of what happened and shift your intention. And this is in contrast to activities or objects which are outright forbidden. So food, that's outright forbidden, animals that are outright forbidden, any object in the world that is outright forbidden to us according to Torah, these things, their life force comes from the three impure klipos, which are not able to be redeemed. They are just totally trapped. And this is why the term for such things is asur, which means forbidden, but it also means bound. It means that it's trapped within it. So the life force within them is trapped, and there's really nothing we can do to redeem these things. So that's what we talked about so far. And today we're going to get a little bit more in depth with all of this. And we're going to talk about, so he doesn't explicitly say this in the chapter, but what I noticed in looking at the chapter is he breaks down the three categories of, remember we talked about the levushim, the clothing, the garments of thought, speech, and action. So he goes into different types of activities in each one of these categories and what that would look like in terms of doing permissible things in these realms versus forbidden things in these realms, and the effect that happens as a result, and what a person would need to do in order to rectify the effect that it has on them, on their soul, and on these objects in order to rectify what happens. So we're starting off here, and he does, so the order by which he looks at these garments in this chapter is actually action, speech, and thought. So keep that in mind. So we're going to start with action, and specific for action is he talks about eating. So eating is an action. So he talks about what happens if a person eats forbidden food. And so we already know the answer to this. We talked about this previously. We talked about if a person eats forbidden food, the food is forbidden. So it's asul, it's bound. So that means the life force within it is totally trapped and it cannot be redeemed. But so the Alter Rebbe says, okay, but what if somebody eats it unintentionally? What if, they go somewhere and they ask if the food is kosher and they're told the food is kosher, and then it's exposed later on that the food is not kosher, and oh my gosh, they ate the food and it wasn't kosher. And let's say while eating the food, they actually had proper intents. They actually had in mind that they'd be eating this food in order to give them vitality and energy to serve God. And then let's say they actually went and did that. So what if, after they ate that food, they felt really good and energized, and they went and they used that energy to serve God, and they learned Torah, and they prayed with a lot of energy from this food. So the Alter Rebbe says that unfortunately, that's great that, they had the good intention with it, but unfortunately the vitality that's within that food cannot be elevated and into the letters of the Torah and the prayer as it would have been had this person been eating permissible food. Because as we mentioned, this food is asul, it's trapped, it's ensnared, it's being held captive within the sitra achar, within the other side, and these three impure klipos that we've been talking about. And this is even goes so far to say that this is even if it's a rabbinical prohibition. So even if it's not just like, we know that there's the Torah prohibitions that are outright outlined in the Torah, and then there's the rabbinical prohibitions. And the Alter Rebbe reminds us that what's written by the rabbinical prohibitions is actually stricter than what's written in the Torah. So just a little side note with this, I don't want to get too much into a tangent, but this is, this really alludes to the fact that in Torah, there's this idea that we have the written Torah, but we also have the oral Torah. And it's just as important in terms of being an observant Jew and in terms of serving God to give as much respect and diligence to the oral Torah as one would to the written Torah. So if a person only believes in the written Torah and they say, oh, I don't know, but the oral Torah, the Gemara, the Mishnah, whatever, that's just written by men, rabbis, they're missing the point, because we believe as observant Jews that at Mount Sinai, when we received the Torah, we did not just receive a written Torah, we actually received an oral tradition that goes together with it. And if, again, it's not the time to really get into this in depth, but if you look in the written Torah, there are actually many allusions to the oral Torah, and it becomes clear if you become a student of the written Torah that there must be an oral accompaniment to it, and it's impossible to understand it without the written accompaniment. So the oral Torah was always part and parcel of the written Torah, and in fact, one could argue, which is kind of what the Alter Rebbe is saying here, that the oral Torah is more important than the written Torah, because with the oral Torah is how we learn the written Torah, and the oral Torah contains the explanation of different things. And so with just the written Torah, we'd be lost, versus if we only had the oral Torah, we'd be missing the written Torah, which is the sanctity of that written word, which is like the source of it all. But the oral Torah really does contain, that is what, when we say we learn Torah, what we're usually doing most of the time is actually learning the oral Torah. So this is why when we say, it's just a rabbinical prohibition, that should not be taken lightly. In fact, rabbinical prohibitions, like the Alter Rebbe is saying here, should be taken with as much stringency, if not more stringency, than written prohibitions. And so now going back to our discussion here about the difference between eating foods that are forbidden versus eating foods that are permissible, and that really this applies, and the Alter Rebbe says here, to things that are permissible in general and versus things that are forbidden, anything. So he says that there's a very big difference in terms of the desire for these things. So he says that the desire for things that are forbidden according to the Torah, he says this is a demon that is a non-Jewish demon. This is a yetzer hara. This is the word yetzer hara means an impulse for bad, basically. Like we all have good and bad impulses. So this impulse for forbidden things comes from idolatrous nations. So meaning to say that and these idolatrous nations, their souls come from the three impure klipos that we've been talking about. So what the Alter Rebbe is basically saying here is that for a Jewish person, it's actually not natural to desire forbidden things. So I find this really interesting because I think what this is basically saying, and it's really something to think about, that if ever there is a Jewish person who desires something that's outright forbidden according to the Torah, that is really intense, because that means that this desire is not really a Jewish desire. It's like they've strayed so far from who they really are as a person, as a Jew, that they're desiring something that actually is not even relevant to them at all. It's a demon from the other side. It's a demon of non-Jews. So something, to keep in mind. And then the Alter Rebbe goes on and he says, okay, but, Jewish people are not perfect, and we do have impulses for negativity and for not the best things. And so what would a Jewish yetzer hara look like? What is a Jewish impulse for negative things? This is if a person desires things that are permissible, but just to fill their taiva, we call it, just to fill their desires. And this is called a Jewish demon. So it's not great. It's a demon, and it's something that is coming from the bad side, but it is a Jewish demon. It's something natural. It's something that is very Jewish. And, but because it's Jewish, we can go back and a person can actually return it back to holiness. As we've explained previously with this whole idea of, just shifting a person's intention and doing tshuva and then being able to redeem these sparks of the life force within the klipas noga and redeem it back to holiness. However, as we also already learned, so this is a little bit of a recap, even though, yes, we can redeem these things. Let's say if a person, engages in some kind of physical activity that is permissible, but without the best of intents, yes, they can go back and they can redeem it and they can bring these sparks back to holiness. But at the time that the person engaged in these activities, before returning them to holiness, they were these klipos, these husks that were found within these objects, did descend into that other side and into the negative klipos totally. And so much so that even after a person goes back and returns and sets their intention back to serving God, there's still going to be a little bit of a remnant of this within them that's going to be stuck to a person's body. And this is because any kind of food or drink that a person eats or drinks, it becomes a part of your blood and a part of your flesh. So if let's say a person indulged in kosher steak, but they did it in a way that was not with the best intentions, it was more for just filling the desires of their body as opposed to giving them energy to serve God, there's going to be a remnant of that negativity that happened at the time that they were eating the food that's going to be stuck within them and attached to their body. There's going to be a remnant of this. And this is why they're going to need what we called the purgatory of the grave, the chibut hakever, in order to totally cleanse them and totally purify them from this impurity that they received from receiving the enjoyment of the world. And this is true pretty much of any time a person, so, it's most people in the world are going to have to go through this, pretty much this purgatory of the grave, because anytime a person had any kind of enjoyment from any kind of mundane things in the world, this is going to give this kind of effect on their body. It's going to leave a little remnant of it there. And the only way to escape this is if a person somehow is able to never have any kind of enjoyment in the world at all of anything physical. And he gives an example of somebody who did actually achieve this level. And this is his Rabbeinu HaKadosh. This is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who lived in the second and beginning of the 3rd century, he was the chief editor of the Mishnah, as we know it now, which is the source for the Gemara. That's the main source of the oral law. So he, according to what Torah says here, is an example of somebody who actually never experienced any pleasure in this world. So he did not have to undergo this purgatory of the grave. But for most people, they do, because most people do experience some kind of enjoyment in this world that is not related to God. And so again, just to recap this section. So it's basically the difference between eating forbidden foods versus permissible foods. So forbidden foods, even if a person has the best intent while they're doing that, it's not going to help. They're not going to be able to elevate the life force within that food to anywhere outside of the 3 impure klipos, because it's bound within them, versus somebody who eats permissible food, even if they don't have the best intention, if they later go back and they later set their intention and return to God, they can elevate this power within the food. However, because they did at that moment, while they were eating the food, have not the best intention, and they were in this self-indulgent state, there is going to be a remnant of that remains within them until the time that they die, when they have to undergo this purgatory of the grave. So that is the section on eating, and this is maybe just my thoughts on this. I'm encompassing within that the section on action, on the garment of action. Now the Alter Rebbe goes into the next garment, which is the garment of speech, and he talks about what happens when a person speaks in a manner that is technically permissible, but is, again, not ideal, versus when a person uses their speech in a way that's outright forbidden. So for permissible speech, that's not ideal, this is somebody who engages in idle chatter. So for example, somebody who's an ignoramus, they're not the brightest person, and they don't know very much, and they're not able to learn. So it's, they didn't necessarily do anything wrong by not speaking words of Torah. They didn't do a sin per se. However, again, it's not ideal. And so what they're going to have to undergo to purify themselves from this is going to be what's written in the Zohar, something called kaf hakela, which is translated as being the hollow of a sling. And so the reason why it's called a hollow of a sling is what happens basically to such a person after they pass away is that they're slung from one end of the earth to the other, one end of the earth showing them truth and reality, and the other end of the earth showing them how they live their life. And then, it's like very painful, because it's like they really see the contrast between these two things, between what is truth and how they didn't take advantage of that truth, and how they actually just live their life in such stark opposition to that. And so it's very painful for the soul. And so now the Alter Rebbe goes on and he talks about, so that's the case for permissible speech. What about speech that's outright forbidden? So what's speech that's outright forbidden is, for example, slander or gossip. These are things that are outright forbidden. And these come from the 3 impure klipos, as we talked about. And this hollow of the sling is not going to help them actually to be able to rid them of this impurity, but rather, in order to be cleansed, they're going to have to descend into what we know of as Gehenom, which is usually translated as purgatory, which is a much more in-depth cleansing of the soul for this. Now the Alter Rebbe gives another example, and he says, what about somebody, like we've talked about, an ignoramus, somebody who's really just not capable of learning, and what happens to them if they just didn't engage in studying Torah and in Torah words? What about in the case of somebody who actually does have the capacity to learn Torah, and instead they just waste their time and they don't engage in Torah? So in that case, this hollow of the slings is not going to be enough in order to cleanse them, but rather it's going to have to receive punishment that is specific to the neglect of Torah study. And this is in addition to the general punishment that it's going to receive, or the general cleansing that it's going to receive, which is given for any negligence of any positive commandment that happens in a place which is called the purgatory of snow, Gehenom shel Sheleg. And this is explained, basically why is it called purgatory of snow? So elsewhere it talks about this idea that basically there's the purgatory of fire, and this is for sins of passion. So if a person does something that's against the Torah out of passion in a passionate way, and then for sins of neglect. So that's what we're talking about here is neglect of Torah study. So a person had the capacity, they have the intellect, they have the brain to learn, but yet they were negligent in doing this. They have to undergo purgatory of snow, and this would be the type of purgatory that for any negligence of any positive commandment, that's the type of purgatory a person would have to go through. And so this is, moving a little bit from, this we talked again about like 3 garments. So we talked about, the garment of action relates to food. The garment of speech relates to speaking words of Torah. This is starting to, again, the Alter Rebbe doesn't give these terms here he doesn't talk explicitly about the garments, but it seems pretty clear to me that that's what he's referring to. So here, this idea of learning Torah is both in the realm of speech and it's also in the realm of thought. And he continues with this here where he talks about is learning, and he says that somebody who spends their time learning about the wisdom of the idolatrous nations, this is also included in learning in being negligent in Torah. And he says that this actually the impurity that's found in the wisdom of the nations, the idolatrous nations, is actually greater even than just being negligent for its own, just being negligent, basically. And now he explains why is it so severe? Like, why is it so much more severe when a person spends their time learning about idolatrous ideas and about wisdoms that come from idolatrous sources, as opposed to just talking idly and like speaking, just spending their time in a more idle way and speaking in idle chatter. Why is learning about the idolatrous wisdom so much worse? And he says that this is because, if you remember previously, we learned about this in a few episodes prior. We talked about the idea of idle chatter and that it comes from the element of wind within the soul. And this relates specifically to the midos of the soul, to the emotive aspects of the soul. If you remember, there's 7 emotive aspects of the soul. So basically, when a person engages in idle chatter, instead of using the element of wind in a holy way, the way that they could with their godly soul, they actually are using it in a negative way, and they're indulging in the animal part of their soul. However, it's only the midos that are affected. It's only the emotions that are affected when a person engages in idle chatter, but not the mind. And the proof of this is that, we specifically talked about ignoramuses and fools and, people that really are not very intelligent. They too can engage in idle chatter. So it's not an intellectual thing. So the intellect is actually preserved when a person engaged in idle chatter or in just, kind of wasting their time idly instead of learning Torah. Versus this is not the case if a person actually spends time and learns about idolatrous wisdom. So they are going and they are actually impurifying. They're bringing impurity to the aspect of the minds, the chabad, if you remember that term, in their soul. So they're actually bringing impurity to the mental faculties of their godly soul, with the impurity that is found within the klipas noga that's found within this wisdom. So the Alter Rebbe explains here basically, so just, to explain, give a little bit more understanding and context for what we're talking about is, you may have heard of this idea of the shviras hakelim, the shattering of the vessels. It's not really the time to get super in depth with it, but basically before the creation of the world, there was this thing that happened where there was the shattering of the vessels. So originally God shone his light, so to speak, into these vessels. And the light really, again, is super brief, and maybe some other time we'll get into this a little bit more in detail. But basically the light that was shown into the vessels was too strong for the vessels to be able to contain it. So the vessels, as a result, shattered all over the world. And there's this idea that these shattered vessels that contain the light of God are found throughout the entire world. And so this is what the Alter Rebbe is getting to here. This explains why within the wisdom of the nations, there are some sparks from this shattering of the vessel, which is why you could sometimes see that there are some truths and some wisdoms to be found within other wisdoms amongst the nations. Like if you study other religions, other philosophies, sometimes there will be a lot of truth within them, because this is coming from those vessels that shattered. However, where is this coming from? This is coming from the achoraim. Again, that word achoraim, it means from the backside of holiness. So it's not in a direct way. It's coming from the backside. And And so this is why a person really, really is not encouraged to spend time studying the wisdom of the other nations. And so again, this is because, as we mentioned, the difference between, and the reason why the learning about the wisdom amongst idolatrous nations and different non-Jewish philosophies is basically what he's saying here, is so much more severe than just idling your time away and speaking in idle chatter and not really spending your time learning Torah and just kind of wasting your time away, is because when you just waste time, then you're only, sure, it's bad for your soul, but you're only affecting the emotions of your soul, but your mind gets preserved. Versus if you learn about non-Jewish philosophies and philosophies that are against Torah, this affects not only the midos, but it actually affects the mind as well. It affects the chabad within the soul. And then the Alter Rebbe does end here. He concludes with an exception. He says, there is an exception. He said, let's say if somebody is learning these philosophies, these ideas for a useful purpose, for example, in order to gain sustenance, like it's for their job. So this would be like, I'm imagining like a professor, like a philosophy professor, that this is how they earn a living. So the Alter Rebbe says in that case, it's okay, so long as they are earning this money, they're studying these things and earning the money in order to have money to serve God in an expansive kind of way. Or the other exception would be if somebody knows how to use these to serve God, to use these wisdoms to serve God. And this was, for example, he says the Rambam and the Ramban, both of which were very well versed in non-Jewish philosophies, and other such people like that who were able to use their external secular knowledge to serve God. So that's it for today. So it's, again, pretty long chapter, but I hope you were able to follow. And just to recap, so we talked about, again, the different types of what happens when a person eats foods that are forbidden, even if they have a good intention, what happens when a person eats food that is permitted, what happens if a person speaks in a way that's permissible, but like just idly and not in the best way, what happens if a person speaks in a way that's outright forbidden, like lashon hara or slander. And then we talked about also learning Torah, and if a person has the ability to learn Torah and they don't learn Torah, what happens? And also what happens if a person not only does not learn Torah, but they actually use their mind for learning secular and non-Jewish subjects that come from idolatrous places. So that's it for today. And tomorrow we will begin chapter 9, and I'll speak with you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.